A reading this morning is taken from the book of Genesis, chapter 37, reading verses 1 to 11. Genesis 37, 1 to 11. Joseph's dreams. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. May God bless this reading of his word.
You notice how often the word jealousy appeared, or jealous appeared in that reading. How many times the writer of Genesis told us as he progressed through the story how Joseph's brothers hated him. You know, jealousy is a terrible thing. And as you look through different stories in the Bible, we find it as part of many stories. Cain and Abel, where Cain's jealousy caused him to rise up and kill his brother. Leah and Rachel, Jacob's wives, who competed with one another and were jealous. Saul and David. Saul was incredibly jealous of David's popularity and in anger just kept wanting to try to kill a young man named David. And there are so many stories that we could just touch on that bring us to this idea of jealousy. But I thought this story of Joseph and his brothers was just absolutely kind of the cap as far as the accounts in the Bible that tell us about jealousy and its horrible consequences. I mean, they looked at the fact that Joseph received special treatment from his father. You saw the reference to the garment that his father gave to him. The older translations referred to it as the coat of many colors. And as they saw this favoritism, and as they saw that Joseph seemed to be responding to it in terms of the fact that he was not beyond telling his father what his brothers were up to, if it was not a good thing. You may have noticed that he did give a bad report on his brothers. And so there's this swelling jealousy and hatred that's going on. And so, as the story progresses, if you're not familiar with it, the brothers rise up as they see Joseph coming, recognize an opportunity that is relatively private and secret, and they determine they're going to try to kill him, and then they realize, well, that's not the best idea, and so they sell him into slavery and report back the lie to their father that he'd been killed by a wild animal. All because of this very strong emotion that seems to be part of shall we call it an undesirable aspect of human nature. I would kind of think about it in terms of the fact that by how we are made, I think we are competitive with each other, aren't we? We try to outdo one another. I think that's why, the New Testament, the encouragement is to outdo one another in showing love. Because we sometimes try to outdo one another in all of the other wrong things that happen. But this competitiveness can turn into a rivalry with very strong feelings toward one another, and then we develop this jealousy, anger, hatred, and you just see the boil of emotions. And I wanted to begin this way because we recognize that when human beings, are in close situations with people who are close to them, that it seems like we develop jealousy and envy and bitterness and anger. And how often that occurs in close family situations. Now, being an only child, I was immune from that. No. I experienced it with other people. But I didn't have a brother or sister to compete with and to be jealous of. But yet, I saw in my friends, my schoolmates, how this often would happen and would occur. And so I want to just kind of, as we begin, I want to raise the question or the thought about, well, what kind of person is able to accept a lesser role, in one of these relationships, because that's what it's about, is that we are competing with one another to be first. And so what kind of person accepts a lesser role of being in someone else's shadow? I think it takes a very special person to do that in the way that we're going to be talking about it this morning. The story is, as Tim mentioned, and the person we want to talk about this morning is Andrew. Andrew was one of the 12 apostles. Excuse me. One of those called by Jesus to be part of that special group of disciples, to be those that he commissioned to send out into the world and to be witnesses of him and of his teaching, of his death, his burial, and his resurrection, which is the definition of apostle that we get in Acts chapter 1. And in this time that they spend, this 3.5 years or however long it might have been, they developed a very close relationship with Jesus. Andrew was also brother and fishing partner, business partner of Peter. That early in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus begins calling his disciples, he goes to the Sea of Galilee. And the first two in those accounts that he calls are Simon, as he is known, or Peter, as we are familiar with him, and Andrew, who are fishing together, and calls them to leave their nets and come follow him, and he will make them fishers of men. Andrew was also, of the 12, one of those, and I thought about this, he's one of those that's on the edge of what we often refer to as the inner circle. Now, we see in Jesus' ministry that as often he's dealing with the apostles, it refers to the 12. But there are special occasions, for example, the Transfiguration, where Jesus has gone up onto the mount with Peter, James, and John. James and John were also fishermen. They were brothers, sons of Zebedee. So you have two families. And often, Peter, James, and John are mentioned together. You think about the children's song. Peter, James, and John in the sailboat out on the deep blue sea. It just... one time, as Jesus has gone and is sitting on the Mount of Olives across from Jerusalem, that we find that Andrew is there with Peter, James, and John. And so, kind of by association with his brother Peter, he's on the edge of the inner circle, but there are many things that Peter, James, and John do that Andrew is not part of. And you can start thinking about the dynamics of brother relations. I mean, what happens when one brother gets to do something and the other brother is there but doesn't? And I can see by some of your faces that you're just kind of imagining how that might work. But what's interesting is that there are 3 unique stories in the Gospel of John that feature Andrew without Peter. And so that Andrew has a very special place, even if he's not part of that inner circle, and even if he has to play, if you might call it, second fiddle to his brother Peter. The first one, and I'll just tell you where they are to begin with, and then we'll come. First one is John 1, and then John 6, and then John 12. And we're going to touch on these very quickly. Okay, the first one in John chapter 1, we have a scene there. In John 1, we have the scene with John the Baptist. And John has been talking to his disciples, those who've been following him, that there's one following me. And he identifies him and says, the Lamb of God. And so John tells the story here, the Apostle John, in writing the Gospel, tells the story here about how John the Baptist is there with 2 of his disciples, and he points to Jesus who's walking by and says, look, the Lamb of God. And what's interesting is these 2 disciples leave John the Baptist, and it's kind of an interesting situation, because as you read the story, what it looks like is that Jesus is walking along, and these 2 guys are following behind him. Doesn't say how far behind him, but they're following behind him. And Jesus turns around and says, what do you want? It's kind of interesting that they're a little reluctant to engage him, but these 2 disciples get to have the first contact with Jesus. And by that, what I'm saying is that they're kind of identified as really the first 2 to really get a chance to talk with Jesus. The gospel writer tells us that one of them is Andrew. I think we need to understand that when we read the stories of the calling of the apostles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that event happens after what we read about in John chapter 1. Because what we read about in John chapter 1 is very shortly after Jesus' baptism. And as Andrew and this unnamed disciple have this opportunity to talk with Jesus, they spend a day with Jesus. Can you imagine? At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, before everything has really started to happen, to have time to spend with Jesus. And then John says, and then the first thing that Andrew did, he went to his brother Simon and said, we have found the Messiah. And he brought Simon to Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Like we would understand that if Peter, if it was God's will for Peter to be part of the apostles, that would have happened another way. But that Simon is responsible for bringing his brother to Jesus. and introducing him to Jesus and saying, this is the Messiah. This is the Christ. This is the one we have been hoping for as our nation for centuries. So Andrew has put together an incredible amount to be able to say that to his brother. And when Jesus meets Simon, he now dubs him, in other words, gives him a new name, calls him the Aramaic name Cephas, or Peter. And and as I read through this story, I think about all of the dynamics of brothers. Of what happens in close relationships. And, I can't help but think about old Andrew, well, not old Andrew, but I just can't help but think about Andrew here saying, well, why didn't you give me a name? Why are you giving my brother special treatment? I'm the one that brought him. I was here first. You hear that? You've got a normal human thing. But Andrew does not seem to be about that kind of a thing. He doesn't seem to be petty. He seems to be really genuinely interested in bringing people, especially his brother, to meet Jesus. The second story, in John chapter 6, is an interesting one. Jesus and his apostles have gone to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. There's a multitude there, a large crowd. And Jesus looks at the crowd, and John tells us that he's testing his disciples, his apostles. And he says, it's late in the day. Where are we going to be able to buy food for all of these people? And we find out later in the story there are 5,000 people. And Philip is introduced back in chapter 1 along with another disciple. And we're introduced to Philip as being from the same town, Bethsaida, as Andrew and Peter. So you suspect they probably know each other from back home. But Philip is kind of a practical thinker. And Philip says, it would take more than 8 months' wages to buy bread for these people. One meal for all of this. And we often, as we think about that story, we think about all of the confusion, the bustling, the bewilderment that would happen as the apostles tried to figure out a way. You're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. You're kind of in a wilderness area. You've got a crowd of people. You don't have a 7-Eleven handy. How do we do that? Well, remember the statement that John made that Jesus did this to test his disciples? Well, it seems that Andrew was the unique one of the bunch. Andrew says, here is a boy who has some food, doesn't have much. He's got 8 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but it's a start. It seems that while all of the other apostles didn't have a clue, Andrew recognized the idea that what we need to do, it goes back to and I know some of you are familiar with this thing about, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is 1 bite at a time. That you can't take on the big task. You can't take on the big thing. Sometimes it's just so overwhelming. But if you break it down and start doing it in the little pieces, that the big one comes together. And so Andrew is the one in bringing this boy's lunch, as we often refer to it, is bringing this boy's lunch to Jesus who opens the door for Jesus to perform a phenomenal miracle of feeding 5,000 people with that little lunch. The third story is really one that comes from late in Jesus' life. I think it was John 12. And it's kind of an intriguing story and has people kind of scratching their heads. And there's a group of Greeks that have come to Jerusalem to worship. Because they're identified as Greek, most commentators think, well, that these are probably not even proselytes. These are what are called God-fearers. They have rejected the nationalism. They have not submitted to circumcision, but they believe in the God that the Old Testament talks about. And so they have come to Jerusalem, and somehow they have heard, as they have been there, maybe they have even heard Jesus speak, but that may be questionable because of what they're about to ask. But this group of Greeks come to Philip. And just as an aside, it's interesting that in John 1, John 6, John 12, that Philip is mentioned in all three of these as well. But they come to Philip. And we kind of scratch our heads. Well, why Philip? He's a relatively obscure one of the apostles. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's just an occasion that they just have come and bumped into him. But they come to Philip and they say, we would like to see Jesus. We want to meet him. We want to talk to him. And what's interesting is that Philip, who is an apostle, who could take them to Jesus, instead goes to Andrew. And you can sit and think about that one all day and try to figure out, is this a case where Philip sees these folks as a problem and he's just kind of passing it on to somebody else? Or is it he's not really sure what to do or what? We don't know. But he goes to Andrew. But it seems like in Philip's mind, Andrew is the guy that is the go-to. And so then John says that now Andrew and Philip go to Jesus and tell him about these Greeks that want to see him. And Jesus responds by saying, basically this is a sign that things are about to happen. He says the hour has come. And as you go through the Gospel of John, what you realize, John chapter 12 is where this occurs. John chapter 13 is the scene of the upper room when they're washing the disciples' feet in the Last Supper. So it is close to the end. And so you look at the role that Simon has played or that Andrew has played in all of these. It's really interesting. He has been a key person in three great moments. That while we have Peter, who has a more prominent role, is more, we would say, more visible, more out front, more interactive with Jesus, more conversation, more recognition. If I suddenly said to you, name a fact about Peter, and you could probably identify a number of things. And then I say, after the sermon, you'll be able to tell one of the three. But names, give me something about Simon or about Andrew. Most people would kind of go, he was an apostle. And that's it. He is definitely living in the shadow of his brother. And yet, as you see, if you can think about it, his place in the conversion, we could use that term of Peter, the feeding of the 5,000 and the bringing the Greeks to Jesus, that there's something about Andrew that tells us, number one, he is not given to jealousy. He's not trying to compete with his brother. Even though, Peter, Andrew, James, and John are kind of a close four, he's still kind of on the edge even of that group. James and John are what Jesus calls them the sons of thunder because of their tempers. Peter we call the impetuous one. I kind of wonder if Andrew was the quiet one. Sometimes you get one like that. Was he the thoughtful one? He was the one that seemed to be comfortable not being out front, but working behind the scenes to help things happen. And you know what? Sometimes it seems it's more the people that work behind the scenes that help things happen, that accomplish more than the people who are out front and getting all the attention. Peter got the attention, if I could suggest it, maybe Andrew did some of the real work. And so here's a man who accepts a role in his brother's shadow. He's a man who doesn't get a lot of recognition historically, other than just being included in the list of the apostles. But here's a man who is known for his service, for helping others, whether it's helping his brother to meet Jesus, helping to feed the 5,000, helping the Greeks to see Jesus, that here's a man, I think we can understand. Sometimes we read stories about biblical characters, and we think of them as the great characters of the Bible, and we see the Peter, we see the James, we see the John, we see the characters in the Old Testament, and we think, I can never be like that. They seem to be larger than life. When you think about the Apostle Paul, it seems larger than life, doesn't he? He seems like somebody that is just not like me. And we see that, and we kind of say that to ourselves. But I think as we look at somebody like Andrew, we say, here's a man that is like me. He's quiet. He's comfortable with not being in the center of attention. But he's not afraid to step out and to do something because of his faith. And everything he does is as a servant, as a helper, as a worker. And I think that's our challenge. Tim's chosen a song for us to close with, and it's called the Servant Song. It's a song about serving. And as we sing this, I want to encourage you, as if you're a Christian, to be thinking about being like an Andrew, being a servant, not feeling like you have to struggle with your personality, your basic nature, and to be a very public figure, but to realize that Andrew was comfortable in being a quiet, behind-the-scenes kind of guy. And maybe if you're not a Christian, to realize that's part of Christianity, is that what we want to do is we want to be people who help, people who serve. And if you want to learn more about that, you can talk with me or with Chad or one of the elders after. Let's stand as we sing.